Welcome to The Brain Factor, hosted by myself, Joy Riddle, and Laura Hawley. We're a part of Meridian Behavioral Healthcare, where we believe that wellness is within everyone's reach. This podcast is a conversation about what research-based protective factors look like in real life. Our hope is that you'll walk away with something that you can use in your own life and have had some fun with us along the way. So let's get started. Welcome to The Brain Factor. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited, as always, to be talking about all these really valuable topics related to mental health and general protective factors. And we love when the work is rooted in research.
Yes.
Yeah, and I know, Laura, that you've been doing a lot of research lately on stigma, so we thought it'd be a really cool topic to talk about today.
I agree with you, and I've been working a lot in stigma, and I think that's such a good example, like when you say we love when things are rooted in research, right? Yeah. What we mean by that is, like, we're not going to bore you to death today, I promise, but there's so many concepts that we as human beings, we know about, we understand, we talk about them, they're meaningful to us, and there's so much like heart and logic and common sense and experience that goes into those that sometimes we don't see or know or aren't aware of the science, right? And then when we find the science, it's either really exciting, like, oh, I knew that, like I already knew that, I was right.
Like innately, as a human being, we understood this concept and how we should apply it to people and our lives.
Absolutely. And then other times we might go, oh gosh, I didn't know that, or that makes so much more sense. And so as I was doing all of this research on stigma, I had another project I was working on, and I had a combination of those experiences. So it was super exciting. One of the interesting things that I found, I think we should start, let's say, what is stigma? Right. Yeah. Like, what is it? And there's a couple of different definitions of stigma. One of the things I found really interesting is the word stigma actually started in the ancient world, right? It was it was ancient Greece or ancient Rome, and it was folks actually had like a branding burned into their skin when they were criminals or charged with some sort of a
freaking me out now,
right? So the stigma was the actual mark. Right. And the person was considered blemished and considered bad. Right. And so we were supposed to avoid them or, not engage in certain things with those individuals who were carrying those stigmas. And then in the 60s, there was a sociologist that gave it its modern meaning, which is, it's really just any negative connotation that's feelings or thoughts that are associated with somebody having a characteristic or a circumstance or a health symptom.
So when someone sees you in a certain way, a negative way, because of some certain characteristics or...
Absolutely. So like, if you have a certain diagnosis or you are exhibiting a certain behavior or struggling with a certain thing, then you are, bad, or they associate some of these other characteristics to you.
But it's just perception, right? Or just what we perceive, we feel. Discrimination is an action.
Correct. Yeah, that's a really good insight, Joy. That's discrimination is when people act on the stigma. The stigma is the thought, the discrimination is like the way people treat. So they're aligned, they're related, but they're different concepts. So, but as I was unpacking stigma, I found that there were so many different types of stigma. There were different ways in which this showed up. And the more that I started sort of unpacking it, the more I realized like how often we encounter all of these different kinds. Yeah. So
is it stigma when I do it to myself?
That is one of the kinds.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's literally self-stigma.
Self-stigma. Right? So, okay.
So public stigma is the one I think we think of the most, right? Which is just like, all of society thinks this way, or like a majority. There's sort of this overarching
general thought that we think is there.
And when we start to believe it, that's what you're talking about, which is the self-stigma.
Yeah.
So, what do you think some other kinds of stigma are? Like, where else have you seen stigma show up?
I think you can see it systemically, which cheating, I do know that is another kind.
Yeah.
But in healthcare, or maybe with a healthcare practitioner, maybe even with, it could be anything. It could be family, it could be friends. You could see it in, coaches and athletics. And you could see it everywhere.
It really shows up in every facet of life. It truly does.
Yeah.
You touched on two really important things that I want to talk about, though. So systemic stigma is when it's removed from an individual, and it's really just about like how things operate.
Yeah.
That was the one that I found that, and you and I talked about this offline.
Yeah,
I found that so fascinating, right? And one of the examples is of that just like kind of, to be honest, stopped me cold in my tracks, because I was like, how do you fix that, right? One of the examples is like, let's say you were out of the workforce, right, for a year. Maybe you had a baby. Maybe you moved, or you're a military spouse, or you had long COVID, or some legitimate reason, and you're going back into the workforce, right? But so you send in your application, your resume, all this stuff, and the computer system automatically filters and puts you at the low bottom of the pile, almost guaranteeing that nobody will see your resume, because you had a gap in employment, and it associates that with an unreliability.
Yeah.
Stigmatizes that.
Yeah,
right?
that's very insightful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
especially with ATS systems that they use now in HR, they just kind of go through and look.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember, it brings me back to a friend of mine who were in a volunteer organization together, and she was like running this and became the president and did all this amazing work, which she did because she believed in the work. But she also said, I've been home building a family, and one day my resume, I'm going to go back to work, and my resume is going to show like this 5-year gap in history. So she was building a piece of that to put into her resume, so that that type of stigma or wouldn't impact her that way.
That that was so smart, though.
Yeah,
she had that awareness
yeah.
that there was the potential, at least, to be stigmatized based on that gap in employment.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is when it's just systemic, right? You could get in the room with HR and be like, oh, I was doing this, and they go, that's great, and not stigmatize that at all. It's
you got to get in the room.
You got to get in the room, right?
Yeah, past the computer.
Like, how do you fix that? I mean, somebody coded it, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, everybody has to be. That was such a lesson for me, that like everybody at every level doing any job really has to be thinking about, anytime we're labeling and categorizing, like we have to be careful about stigma. So I thought that was interesting. The other one you mentioned was healthcare, like health practitioner and healthcare stigma. That you would think doesn't exist.
You would, right? Like, can I just please count on my general practitioner?
Right.
Who might be better with it than maybe in some more specialized fields.
Right.
But that's really a scary thought.
It really is, and it shows
I mean,
up in
we're
ways.
Talking about stigma in a broad context,
Sure.
not just mental illness right now.
Absolutely. Like, I think one of the kind of classic examples of healthcare practitioner stigma is like, if you're overweight and you go to the doctor and you're like, hey, I'm having these symptoms, these issues, and they focus on the weight loss versus the actual symptoms you're having.
How many calories did you eat?
Right. Like, have you been working out? Like things like that, when really there might actually be a problem, but they're distracted by their own stigmatization of your weight, right?
Yeah.
And I used to think like, does that really happen? Those are just crummy doctors, right? And then I actually very recently had a situation that I want to share that absolutely blew my mind. So, last month I had COVID. Right. And I got over it pretty quickly, and I tested negative, but I had a lingering cough. And I have had COVID 3 times, since 2020. So through work, we have this really great service where I can just kind of hop on and get on with telehealth with a doctor and get prescriptions and things like that when it's like lower level stuff, right? So I had tested negative, everything else was good. I just had this lingering cough. So I didn't bother making it up. It was late at night. I just hopped on with telehealth, and the doctor was lovely, and he actually had COVID the previous month, and he said, I had the same thing. I'm going to call you in the inhaler and the prescription that worked for me. And as we were talking, I mentioned that I had taken an antiviral, and he said, he sort of to the side was just like, well, I didn't take that. And I picked up on it, but I thought, no, like, I'm not, that's not a thing. And I said, yeah, well, and that it made me feel guilty and shameful, which is one of the things that we can recognize when we're being stigmatized, when we feel those things, right? And so it
made you feel guilty because you took the antiviral.
Right. Like I was like, oh, this doctor is clearly having some thoughts about this. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, right? So then I responded by saying, well, my primary care, she said it can help with like maybe long-term effects. And, I've had this thing 3 times, so I should probably, start thinking about that, ha, ha, ha. And his answer was, or you could just prevent getting it again.
Yeah. And you know what?
As though I hadn't taken any kind of
because
precaution.
I know you so well, and we worked together like when
during
COVID
the
happened during the
yeah.
first 1.5 to 2 years of the pandemic, and I know the precautions you took.
Yes.
Like, there weren't many more that could be taken except getting one of those plastic bubbles.
Yeah, like a human-sized
we wore
hamster wheel.
masks all the time, sanitized, everything, stayed 6 feet away. I know you took every precaution.
Right.
And it's really unfortunate that they were just like, well, you should probably, look, why don't you do what you're supposed to do, Laura?
Right, because clearly you're not.
Go sit in the corner.
Yeah, and so and it's so interesting because it was like 4 or 5 days later that I was doing the research on stigma, just how things shook out, and I got to that part and I went, that's what that was.
You bad man.
No, sit down.
Because he had an implicit bias of some sort.
Absolutely. And so I share that because I think, sometimes we miss like what that is and like looking for those warning signs of how we're feeling and all of that kind of stuff. And there's other kinds of stigma too. Like we covered a couple of them, but there's also like label avoidance. If we really think about it, we know what that is. That's like, disassociating yourself from a group you actually belong to because that group is stigmatized, right? Or like, like, oh, I might belong to that group, but I'm different, I'm not like everybody else, right?
Well, going back to the healthcare one you just talked about, one of the things that makes me think about is the social effect of that. And you're like, I know about stigma. I know what you just did, you rotten man.
But people don't know that.
But people don't know that. And then maybe they don't seek help the next time and they just like, they feel really bad because they're guilty. Someone made them feel bad. So they just go over to the pharmacy and they buy something over the counter and they're not getting the appropriate health care that they need.
That is so true.
The way they were treated. I know you're going to just be like, whatever, and continue, recognize it, deal with it, use all your tools and go, no, this isn't me.
Yeah. But you're absolutely right. Those are the impacts, right? It causes things like label stigmatization, right? Label avoidance, self-stigma, right? And then the impacts of those are absolutely like, lower quality of healthcare, right? From our own, like when we're feeling stigmatized, we're going to avoid that situation, label, or behavior that's making us feel that way, right? We're also going to, if the physicians are stigmatizing or the healthcare practitioners are stigmatizing, they're going to spend less time in appointments. They're going to ignore certain symptoms. They're going to not give the same treatment, right? So from both ends, there's so much impact that can really hurt a person's quality of life, and healthcare, and in a substance misuse situation can really help prevent like getting recovery and treatment. And I mean, there's so
much stigma there.
So much stigma and so many lasting long-term impacts of stigma, right? Some of the other kinds are like perceived stigma. Sometimes we are so convinced that other people will stigmatize us that we change our behaviors or what we're doing, right? Like when I go out to lunch with my super skinny friends, I order a salad no matter how hungry I am. Yeah, my friends are not going to stigmatize me.
No.
That's
probably offer you some of their fries.
Right, they'll be like, you sure? You do want ice cream or something?
Is that enough for you?
But like, you have this perception that people are going to stigmatize a certain behavior or characteristic. And so we act on that, right? Yeah. And there's so many different kinds. One of the things I found the most interesting, and this for me was the new information, right?
Oh, okay.
Is where does stigma come from? Like, why do we stigmatize? And I had a lot of theories, I had a lot of ideas and thoughts about it, but when I looked really into the science and the research, there are three main theories of where stigma comes from.
Tell me.
We have there's label identification, labeling theory, social identification theory, and then terror management theory. So the labeling is probably the one like that's the most like, oh yeah, I get that. Right? Because like we label
stuff all the time.
It's what we do as human beings, right? We name things, we label things. And I think, knowing that we do that for our own understanding. So if somebody's labeling you, they're doing that so that they're trying to navigate and understand. It really doesn't say anything about you.
I wonder what labels are on me.
Fierce and intelligent and
beautiful. Too much. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't.
But yeah, and it's I heard a phrase once, you've probably heard it, where, other people's opinions of me are not my business.
Right.
And to me, that's very protective, that idea, because I'm like, well, I don't have to own that.
No.
That doesn't have to turn into self-stigma or perceived stigma or label avoidance for me, because I don't have to take it. I don't have to take that on as my own.
Yeah.
And that's really all that theory is just this natural idea that we label things as human beings. When we label things, we start to categorize them, and that's where stigma comes in, where we can put them into groups of good and bad.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous. You're gonna absolutely love the next theory, though.
Yeah.
Because you and I have talked about this. And so many times that I was literally giddy when I discovered it and could not wait to talk to you about it. And that is the social identification theory, which is literally like, okay, so I have to deviate, like for our viewers and our listeners. So Joy and I have been sharing like memes and TikToks and links with each other about the this whole trend about making fun of the different generations of people. Literally, we're making fun of people. I'm so sorry, it's like there's a couple of folks, influencers and TikTokers and YouTubers, who will go on and they'll say like, oh, the different generations at an 8 a.m. Monday morning meeting, and they'll be like, this is how the boomer behaves, and this is how the Gen Z and the Gen X behaves, and all of that stuff. And we just get the biggest kick out of it, and we're dying laughing at this stuff. And then I found that in my research.
Yeah.
It's like this idea that we not only identify with the characteristics of the generation we belong to, but we take on even more of it because we think it's the best one to belong to.
What's the one that we grew up with?
Yeah.
I mean, I watch a lot of the Gen X ones because I'm Gen X, and like the stuff they're saying isn't a lie. We did play outside all day long and drink from the hose. I mean, because you weren't allowed to come in and out. I remember it was like in or out. That's it. You're not doing this in and out thing.
Yes. Yeah. So it's all based in these nuggets of truth, right? But our perception and our own stigmas, right, cause us to label and categorize. So, if I'm being totally like vulnerable and rawly honest, I'll watch those and I'll see some of the other generations and I'll be like, yeah, they do that. They suck, right? Like, and that's not fair.
No, it's not. It's just different.
Right. And as humans in the social identification theory of where stigma comes from, we think ours is the best.
Yeah.
Therefore, the others are substandard and run the risk of being stigmatized, right? So when you have an environment, whether it's a society, a community, a family, a workplace, that's predominantly run by one generation of folks, you're going to have a little bit of stigma being passed along to those other folks. And I, as funny as I found that, I also found that like very poignant. Like, oh, I could see where I even do that unintentionally.
Oh yeah. I know I do those things in my mind, but I'm cognizant, I'm aware of it. So then I think, no, this is actually really good that they care about their personal life and their balance. And they're like, I'm done. Sorry.
Yeah, that's
it's
after
over.
Work hours.
Yeah.
So, you just said something like beautiful, right? What you just said is where we that's part of how we stop stigma.
Yeah.
We talked in the very beginning about the difference between stigma and discrimination. So thoughts, feelings, knee-jerk reactions, automatic things that occur in our brain. I don't want to say we don't have control over that, because we do. We can do some work on that, right? But like, we do get to decide what we do with it.
Yeah.
And that's a big, big part of what causes discrimination, is that stigma. So if we find ourselves like we're sharing these TikToks and we're laughing about it, but you're going into the workpess and you're not treating people differently.
No.
And that's the key, right?
I actually most times think they're smarter.
Right? You're like, oh.
Like, what was wrong with us?
Yeah. So and I think that's cool. That it's what you're doing with those thoughts and with those ideas. I think that is so important.
Yeah.
The last theory of the three about where stigma comes from is the terror management theory, which is, that to me is the most toxic, right? That's the whole
terrible thing. It just,
that's if you've had something bad happen to you, or you're experiencing something negative, I have to somehow make that your fault, because if you caused it, then it can't happen to me and I'm safe. Like, it's my own existential fears that play into the way that I'm going to think about you and treat you and all of that. And I understood that one when I learned about it, but it made me sad. Everyone's uncomfortable. So.
Yeah.
Well, then I guess in these last couple of minutes, what begs the question is I got excited about all the research, right? Like, where it came from, what it is, what causes it, the different kinds, but what do we do about it?
You tell me. I think that we have to, as individuals, take responsibility for that. I mean, that I can't do anything about the systemic bias in the healthcare system. I just really can't. I have no control over that. But I can take care of myself, my thoughts, my beliefs, and how I'm going to treat people, or even maybe what you might say to a doctor next time that says something to you like, oh, well, maybe you could do a better job preventing that.
Right.
And calling them out,
right.
you know.
Stand up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also thought about that too, I've been sitting here thinking, when you were like, yeah, but you knew better in that situation. Maybe we need to even go a step further.
After.
Yeah. Maybe we need to even go a step further, though, and check in with the people in our lives that we care about. And if they're experiencing that and they don't recognize the stigma, is somebody not getting help for something that they need to be getting help for? Maybe have that conversation about, understand that one of those barriers might be stigma, and what that looks like in all the ways it could be showing up for them.
Yeah.
My big thing with what I do, and it alone is not enough, but it's the one thing I really latch on to stop myself from unintentionally stigmatizing, is I really watch my language.
Yes.
The words that I use.
Yeah.
I think
there's so many words that you shouldn't be using.
Yeah. So one of the big things is not to use any terms that are an actual diagnosis as an adjective.
Yeah.
I
hear it so much. I don't know how many times over the past week I heard, oh, I'm just OCD. And I'm like, no, you're not. You just like things in a certain spot. You do not. It's like,
clean.
Oh, I'm so OCD. What? Oh, and reshifting things and moving them. No, you're not.
Because there's people suffering with that, right? That's stigmatizing.
That's a serious,
Or
issue.
I think the phobias get used a lot too. Oh, I'm claustrophobic. No, you're uncomfortable in enclosed spaces, but it's not a disorder that is disrupting your life that you're seeking treatment for, right? That's a whole different thing that people suffer from. Or the weather being bipolar. Yeah. That's another one that I think is
always
common.
Struggle with the word crazy.
Yeah.
Because I don't use that in a mental health type of way, but I will say it about something else. I don't know, that Roomba is acting crazy right now, but,
Right. And if you really drill that down, why is the Roomba acting crazy?
Why?
Because it's erratic
it's
and it's unpredictable.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's
so I try so hard to erase that word from my entire vocabulary.
Yeah. Well, I'll totally confess that I have trouble with that one too. I say the word crazy. Every now and then, depending on how I'm using it, I will catch myself and go, ooh, that was not your best choice.
I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, it wasn't your best word choice. And I try to move away from it, but that one it means so many different things in our language, which is a problem in and of itself, that it means so many different things it shouldn't. But we do use that word. I think that's a really, really hard
Well, and
one.
it's also used as a good word. Oh, that was cray, or that was crazy. And that's usually something that was a lot of fun.
How was the concert? It was so crazy.
Yeah, and that's a good thing too. So
Yep. So that is a hot button word.
Yeah.
It is so different. But yeah, using, people first language, right?
Yeah.
They're not
Definitely.
a schizophrenic. They're a person with schizophrenia.
Has a schizophrenic disorder or schizophrenia.
Yep. And
or you're not an addict. You're a person who struggles with addiction.
Right.
All those different things.
People first. Nobody's one thing, right?
No.
So I think those are some of the things that we can do to individually to help fight stigma, right? But I think I want to close with this. I have so enjoyed this conversation. I think I want to close with, of all the different types, all the different kinds, all of where it comes from, all of that, I think that if you are self-stigmatizing, that's the one I really want that to be what we end with, right? Yeah. If you're self-stigmatizing and you're not able to get out of that, that's where it's perfectly okay and helpful to go ahead and seek some outside help. I think that's when counselors and therapists can really be very, very helpful to help us navigate through that intense self-stigma, and to recognize that that's coming from a very real place of all of these things that are happening in society around us, that stigma is powerful, stigma is real, and when we're using it on ourselves, we might need a little extra help.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, thanks for joining us, and we will see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Brain Factor. Joy and I are so thrilled to be having these needed conversations. We'd love to hear your feedback on this episode, so if you could drop a comment or leave a review with your thoughts or any requests that you may have, it would be appreciated. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Living a healthier and happier life starts with one step, and we're excited to be on this journey with you. Until next time.